And hello and welcome back in, everyone, to part 2 of the Eric the Red Vikings draft recap. Now, as we said, for those of you listening on the podcast, we are recording this on 2 separate days. So for those of you watching on YouTube, the first reaction video is a separate video, my reaction to rounds 1 through 3 of the Vikings draft from earlier this weekend. This video and this part 2 of the podcast is a reaction to rounds 4 through 7, looking at what the Vikings did over this Saturday as we are recording here on Saturday night. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up the draft results for what the Vikings accomplished or what they may not have accomplished over this day. So, looking at the Vikings picks, the Vikings coming into today had 6 picks over these 4 rounds. They had 3 4th-rounders, 2 5th-rounders, and 1 6th-rounder. No 7th-rounders. Everyone in the world, or at least everyone inside of Twin Cities media, seemed to think that Rick Spielman was desperate to find himself in the way that he was desperate seemingly to find a 2nd-round pick. He was desperate to find some 7th-round picks lying around somewhere. Well, as it turns out, the Vikings made no trades today. They did not trade any of their picks. I do believe that is accurate. I checked this out earlier when I was looking at the picks before we came in to record here. I am pretty sure that the only trade the Vikings made during the draft process over these past 3 days was their 1st-round pick, trading back. So, all of the picks they came into today with is what they left with. The players they took are the players that were in those 6 picks. Now, it is worth noting in the same breath that while the Vikings did not trade at any other point after the 1st round during this draft, they did still make 11 picks in this draft. Now, I do believe it has been stated in the past that Rick Spielman likes to have at least 10 picks in any given draft. So that was mission accomplished, I guess you could say, with taking 11 picks. And it may have been that the Vikings felt comfortable enough already having 11 picks that they did not feel they needed to try and trade down to accumulate more draft capital in order to take more players. Now, that said, it does seem like the Vikings took or had some interesting takes on what they were looking for in day 3 of the draft. So let's go ahead and jump into this, looking at this more specifically. Going into this draft process, if you had pressed me, what are the Vikings going to be looking for on day 3 of the draft? I would have said they will be looking for at least a linebacker, a tight end, a cornerback, and a defensive tackle. I would have expected they would take at least one player from those 4 positions. And the only reason I was wrong is because they took the linebacker in the 3rd round on day 2. That is the only part of that caught me by surprise. So go ahead and write that down. Apparently I had another take that hit, I guess, sort of, kind of, for the most part. But with that said, the Vikings' first pick in the 4th round at 14th overall, I took the time this time to look up how to pronounce this person's name, and now I can't completely remember. So I'm going to believe off of my memory his name is Kene Nwangu, or possibly Nwangu. But this player was a running back at Iowa State University and is coming in here. As we are going through these picks, my reaction is not going to be at all based on any sort of talent evaluation or anything like that. As I said in part 1 of this draft recap, I am not a talent evaluator. I am not a draft scout. I am not a player scout of any kind. The only sort of scouting, I guess, to put that in quotes, if you will, that I have the ability to do is, as a fan of the Vikings, looking at what I am hoping that they are able to find in order to make the team better, with the ultimate goal of winning the Super Bowl sometime before I die, I guess. Sometime before the end of time, before the heat death of the universe. Hopefully the Vikings will find their way into the Super Bowl and actually find a way to win it. All that to say, I did not expect the Vikings to take a running back. As we went through evaluating where running backs have been taken by the Vikings, it is the case, I believe, of the 3 that were taken, that they were all 3rd round or higher. So this is actually later than any of the Vikings running backs have been drafted during the Mike Zimmer, Rick Spielman era of the Vikings. With that said, it did not seem like running back was something that the Vikings were looking for, but it can be said that they were probably looking for a kicker or a kick returner or a punt returner, which apparently is what this player, Kene Nwangu, I'm going to give myself plenty of opportunities to get his name wrong. This is what he at least did in part while he was at Iowa State. So looking to have him come in and potentially be running back depth, looking at him potentially coming in to challenge for a return spot, a starting returner. Now, I can also say with not having expected the Vikings to be looking for more running back depth, they did carry 4 running backs on their active roster at times last season, with not only Dalvin Cook and Alexander Madison, but also with Amir Abdullah and Mike Boone. Amir Abdullah is still currently with the team. Mike Boone is not. So if their intention is to carry 4 running backs once again, this is one of those players who will be competing for one of those spots. If not, however, it does look like potentially Amir Abdullah should be preparing to not be a Viking this year. I was somewhat surprised that he was able to make the team last year, that the Vikings carried 4 running backs, and that he was still doing return duties at least some of the time last season. The Vikings' return game was terrible last season, absolutely horrendous, and it looks like they took a mid-round pick to try and help address that spot. So, after that, moving on to the second of the 4th-round picks that the Vikings made, the Vikings took a cornerback out of the University of California, Cameron Bynum. Once again, I heard his name said out of Rick Spielman's mouth when he announced the pick, and I don't remember if that is accurate. But Cameron Bynum, University of California. The other sticking point of having a linebacker taken in the 3rd instead of the 4th round with my predictions is that Cameron Bynum is not projecting to actually be a cornerback in the NFL. He was announced by Rick Spielman as a safety. Apparently going through the pre-draft process, a lot of teams were looking if they had taken him to move him to safety. What I have heard, what I have read, is that for some reason the light just got brighter in the video, but from what I have heard and what I have read about Cameron Bynum is that he does not have the speed that would be necessary to be a successful cornerback in the NFL, and so that is where looking to move him to safety is. Another thing I will say here early on in this recapping what the Vikings have done, it seems like everyone that the Vikings took on day 3 will be projecting to be a project. A player who is not fully formed, which I guess is the expectation, but I noticed it coming up consistently in the different draft evaluations of each player as we were going through the process here. So don't necessarily expect any of these players to become great players or necessarily even good players. These are players who will be competing to be depth players for the most part, for the greatest likelihood. That is what it will be. It seems that you maybe find 1, 2, or 3 maybe good or great players in later rounds in the NFL, and not on each team, like total over the entirety of the NFL, over the entirety of those different picks. Now, I did see on the ESPN on ABC's broadcast earlier today, right when they started the 4th round of the draft, something like 66% of all players who were on NFL teams last season were drafted in rounds 4 through 7 or were undrafted free agents. So it is worth noting that these players will have value for the team this season. It has yet to be determined for any of the draft picks, as we have already mentioned in the first part of this podcast episode. But for any of the draft picks in particular, we don't know what they're going to turn into or what sort of player they're going to turn into. So keep that in mind as we are continuing to go down this list. The Vikings, with their 3rd, 4th round pick of the day, took a defensive end out of Florida State, Janarius Robinson. From what I read, the write-up on him, he apparently started out his football career as a wide receiver and then transitioned over to defensive end. So this now is another player who was not originally in the position where the Vikings drafted him. And so some of the knock on him is that he still has to gain the size to actually be able to play on an NFL defensive line. So we will have to see if that is something that he is able to do, if he is able to compete to be a depth player. This is the only position where the Vikings overlapped on a position they drafted. The only position that the Vikings took 2 of in this draft was defensive end, with taking Patrick Jones II out of Pitt in the 3rd round. So there has definitely been a focus in the free agency period on improving the defense. There has been a lot of focus nationally on the poor quality of play seen out of the defense last season, and a lot of people have been pushing for the Vikings to help address the defensive line in this draft, and the Vikings have certainly done that. We, once again, will have to see how that plays out. In the 5th round, this is a name I did not look up, so I don't know why I do this why do I do this to myself? Why do I go into the process of recording these things and don't know how to pronounce people's names? This is not a thing that I should be doing. This is not what you come here for. You don't come here for me to mispronounce people's names, but here we are nonetheless. The thing that is maybe even worse about this is that this is a player out of the Big Ten. This is a player coming out of Iowa who the Minnesota Gophers would have played against and who I should know because of that, but I don't. So I'm going to attempt to pronounce this person's first name as Emir, probably, maybe, that's my best guess. Emir Smith-Marset is a wide receiver out of the University of Iowa. The Vikings, it has also been said, have been looking for a consistent 3rd wide receiver, a wide receiver 3, someone who can come in and be a deep threat every once in a while during the game. It sounds like that is what you are getting out of this player. This is a very fast receiver from the sound of it. Also a receiver or a player who can come in and potentially be in the return game for you. This is a player who had over 1,000 yards receiving and 1,000 yards in the return game during his career at Iowa. It sounds like maybe there were some questions as well about whether he was actually utilized to the best of his abilities and capabilities while he was at Iowa. So, coming into the NFL, you're looking at hopefully putting him into the return game, hopefully having him compete for a 3rd wide receiver position on your team. And it looks like the Vikings, once again, now drafting a 2nd player who might be able to come in and be in the return game for you, are looking to find ways to address their special teams, especially their kick return game in particular in this draft. Now, another player who the Vikings took who was, I guess you could say, a dual threat player in college. With their 2nd to 5th round pick, the Vikings take Zach Davidson, a tight end out of Division II Central Missouri. Now, it sounds like this player is not only a tight end, but he was also Central Missouri's punter. And it sounds like he's like 6'7". So can you imagine a 6'7" punter? That guy must be enormous. I guess I don't know how consistently you find very tall punters, but it seems like a very tall person, especially as a punter. So once again, the joke is, could this person come in and play their 2nd position as well? There was also a joke during his availability to the media today that apparently he is also a semi-capable long snapper. So however this person ends up being used, if he comes in and is able to serve either as tight end depth or as some sort of special teams player, wherever that may be, that would be fantastic. We have seen that the Vikings do enjoy taking their late round tight ends who are able to come in. Tyler Conklin, who is currently slotted to be the 2nd tight end for the Vikings, I believe was in a similar position. And so as we're looking at this is not out of the norm for the Vikings to be taking a tight end in this position. And once again, we're hoping that this player will perform well as a pro in the NFL. Finally, with the final pick that the Vikings had available to them, their lone 6th round pick, the Vikings took defensive tackle Jalen Twyman out of Pittsburgh. So we now have two of Pitt's defensive linemen from last season. Apparently, at the very least, Jalen Twyman was a teammate of Brian O'Neill when Brian O'Neill was still at Pitt, the Vikings starting right tackle. So you have a little bit of familiarity, I guess, with at least one of your players on your team. I don't know how much of an impact that will have. It was noted during Christian Darrisaw's press conference when he was here down in Eagan at the Vikings facility that he does not know any of the Vikings players or didn't already. There aren't, I guess, any Virginia Tech players, and he wasn't aware of anyone he had played against in college either. So I don't know how much familiarity people necessarily need to have when you're coming into the team. I don't know how often that necessarily happens. We did see it happen at least somewhat consistently early on with a couple of different teams drafting offensive specialists who played with the quarterback that they're going to be paired up with in college. But it's not necessarily, I would say, a norm to see players from the same team or who know each other already in the NFL when you are drafted coming into that position. So, with all of that said, that is all of your draft picks in parts 1 and 2 of this podcast, and for the 2 separate videos in the YouTube player for those of you watching on YouTube. So, that is everything that we had from that aspect. Other notes from the draft or the post-draft now process. I did not get the opportunity to look up undrafted free agents who the Vikings may have signed, so we're going to go ahead and wait on looking at potential undrafted free agents who may or may not be able to make the team. I don't know whether that will happen next weekend or the following weekend because the Vikings do, it sounds like, have a rookie minicamp of some sort coming up, which is going to bring all of these different potential rookies to Minnesota to actually have practice down in Eagan. So we'll potentially be waiting to see what happens with that. The one thing that should be noted is that Rick Spielman was quoted as saying that he does anticipate there to be a kicking competition during training camp this season. So even though the Vikings did not draft a kicker, they will either be looking to bring in an undrafted free agent or potentially a veteran to compete with Gregory Joseph, who is the only kicker right now on the Vikings roster, who the Vikings signed from the Tampa Bay practice squad. So, at the moment, the only returning special teams player, to my knowledge, who is slotted to be starting is Britton Colquitt, who is our punter. So we have yet to see what is going to happen with what was a very poor operation from special teams last season. We will see what happens with that position in the future. But looking at how this draft played out, what my expectations and hopes were, as we said in part 1, I was happy to have an offensive tackle taken in the first round. I was happy with the Vikings landing Kellen Mond, as I tweeted earlier, and as I said in part 1, I was interested, I guess, in Kellen Mond with his positional ranking as the 4th overall quarterback on Chris Sims' quarterback draft rankings. So, he said, and what I retweeted of him was that he believes that Kellen Mond is a top 20 talent and that he was able to slide all the way down into the early 3rd round and the Vikings were able to grab him there. As it stands, it looks like it was a good thing for those of us who may have wanted Kellen Mond to come in, that the Vikings made that trade with the Jets to acquire 2 more 3rd-round picks, because it doesn't look like he was going to make it much past 66 where the Vikings took him. So with all of those things said, and with the memory space running out on my computer, I'm probably going to end this episode of the podcast here. We will be looking ahead next week, I guess, to further thoughts at this draft, seeing what else might happen in the NFL. And we have a deadline looming for the NFL with releasing the schedule. The NFL will be releasing the NFL schedule for the regular season by May 12th at the latest. So there is potential for that to be ready for next week's episode if they release it earlier than May 12th. And for sure, by 2 episodes from now, we will have a schedule to analyze for where the Vikings will be playing. We already know who they will be playing. We discussed that a little bit previously in a previous episode, but we'll actually get to see when they will be playing these opponents, when their bye week will be, when all those different sorts of things will be, and how this new 17-game schedule will shape up for the Vikings in this coming 2021 regular season. So, with that said, Thank you for watching, those of you on YouTube, to this second video from this podcast. For those of you listening on your podcast players, thank you for sitting through both parts of this. Thank you for sitting to the first time recording on 2 separate days. I do not anticipate recording episodes on 2 separate days moving forward, but I do think there is potential to split these episodes into separate videos. It will depend on how things look moving forward, depending on how much information we have to provide for you in any of these future episodes. With that said, my name is Eric Beck, and this has been the most recent episode. I still am trying to figure out how to end these things. My name is Eric Beck. This has been the Eric the Red podcast.